Around 3100 BC, a people appears in southern Mesopotamia, already speaking a language related to nothing else on Earth. Not Semitic, not Indo-European, not linked by any known thread to any neighboring tongue, ancient or modern. They call themselves the Black-Headed people. They arrive already building cities, already writing, already irrigating a floodplain with an expertise that looks less like invention than inheritance from somewhere no one has ever located. That's the shape of every mystery still ahead. 22 of them, each built the same way, real evidence, carefully gathered, that simply refuses to close the case. A language with no ancestor. A structure no engineer can fully explain. A vanishing with no trail. Scholars have had every advantage modern tools can offer, and the files remain open. The mound is called Tel al-Muqayyar today, a low rise of eroded mud brick in southern Iraq that doesn't look, at first glance, like the birthplace of cities. But beneath it lies Ur, one of the oldest urban centers ever excavated, and one of dozens of city-states built by a people who called themselves, in their own language, the Black-Headed people. We call them Sumerians, a name borrowed from their Akkadian neighbors. And the honest answer to where they came from is that no one knows. This isn't a minor gap in an otherwise complete picture. It's a genuine void at the foundation of urban civilization itself. By around 3100 BC, the Sumerians were already building walled cities like Uruk, already operating complex irrigation systems along the Tigris and Euphrates, and already writing. The cuneiform script pressed into clay that represents, as far as archaeology can currently confirm, the earliest true writing system anywhere on Earth. Layer beneath layer of excavation at sites like Eridu shows continuous settlement stretching back further still, toward the 6th millennium BC, but the deeper you dig, the harder it becomes to say with confidence who, exactly, was living there and what language they spoke. That question of language is where the mystery sharpens into something genuinely strange. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no confirmed relatives, living or dead, anywhere in the world. It isn't Semitic, like the Akkadian that eventually replaced it as a spoken tongue. It isn't part of the Indo-European family that would later produce everything from Sanskrit to English. It simply stands alone, its grammar and vocabulary unconnected to anything else linguists have ever classified. For a civilization this influential, the source of humanity's first cities, first law codes, first epic literature, first system of writing, to leave behind a language with no traceable ancestry is, by any reasonable standard, an anomaly. The mainstream archaeological position holds that the Sumerians were likely one of several populations already living in southern Mesopotamia for millennia before cities emerged, their culture and language developing locally over an extended period rather than arriving from elsewhere fully formed. Under this reading, the mystery is largely an artifact of the record itself. Writing didn't exist yet to capture whatever migrations, mixing, or gradual cultural formation actually took place across the centuries before Uruk's walls went up. The Sumerians don't have a clear origin story because no one was writing anything down yet when that origin was actually happening. But the Sumerians' own traditions complicate this simple account. Their own literature, particularly the Sumerian king list, describes kingship itself as having descended from heaven after the Great Flood, naming cities and rulers in a sequence blending clearly historical figures with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Some scholars read this as pure myth-making, a retrospective attempt to grant divine legitimacy to political institutions. Others note that the list's structure, however exaggerated its numbers, may preserve genuine memory of the earliest transition from scattered settlements to organized city-states, a folk memory of real, if poorly understood, historical change. Beyond mainstream archaeology, More speculative theories have proposed everything from an origin in the Indus Valley to a homeland somewhere in the Caucasus or Central Asia, based on scattered, contested linguistic and cultural comparisons that most specialists regard as unproven. None have gained wide scholarly acceptance, and the genetic and archaeological evidence remains too sparse from this early period to settle the question definitively either way. What remains, in the mud brick ruins of Ur and Uruk, is a civilization that gave the world its first writing, its first cities, its first laws, and never told us, in any language we can trace to its roots, exactly where its own people had come from. Is that silence simply the accident of writing arriving too late to capture the answer? Or is there something about this particular origin that even the Sumerians themselves, kings and scribes included, no longer remembered by the time they finally put reed stylus to clay? Some miles north of that last excavation, past the river's bend where the land begins to rise into limestone hills, another site waits beneath the wind-scoured earth of Göbekli Tepe. There is no city here, no palace, no marketplace, no trace of the ordinary machinery of ancient life, no homes, no hearths, no burial grounds. What rises from this Turkish hillside instead are stones, massive T-shaped pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall, arranged in careful circles, and carved with animals that seem to watch the visitor as much as the visitor watches them. Foxes, scorpions, vultures, serpents coiling toward the sky. The pillars themselves are strange in a way that resists easy description. Abstracted human forms, arms bent at the elbow, hands folded near where a belt would sit, as though the stone itself were standing at attention, waiting for something. The site was dated, conservatively, to around 9600 BC. Let that number settle for a moment. This is not a temple built after agriculture, after writing, after the first cities took root along the rivers of Mesopotamia. This is a temple that predates all of it, by 6,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by 7 millennia. It predates the wheel, the plow, pottery. The people who quarried these pillars, who dragged them across the landscape, who carved them with tools of flint and bone, were hunter-gatherers. They had no permanent homes. And yet they built this. Mainstream archaeology offers an explanation, and it is a compelling one. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who led excavations at the site for nearly 2 decades, proposed that Göbekli Tepe may represent something more radical than a religious curiosity. It may represent a turning point in human history itself. Schmidt's theory, cautiously embraced by many in the field, suggests that the need to gather, to build, to worship together at a site like this may have been what drove scattered hunter-gatherer bands to settle down in the first place. Not the other way around. Not agriculture first, religion second, but the reverse. Belief, in this telling, built civilization rather than civilization producing belief. If that theory holds, then everything we assumed about the order of human development deserves a second look. We have long imagined the story as a ladder. First food security, then leisure, then culture, then gods. Göbekli Tepe suggests the latter may have been standing on its head, but the mainstream explanation, however compelling, does not answer every question the site raises. Why, for instance, was it buried? At some point, deliberately, layer by layer, the enclosures were filled in with rubble and soil, not by erosion, not by time, but by human hands. Entire complexes were entombed, seemingly on purpose, then built over with new enclosures above. Why bury a sacred site rather than simply abandon it? Was this an act of reverence, sealing something too powerful to leave exposed? Or was it something closer to an ending, a deliberate closing of a chapter, perhaps even a warning? And who, exactly, were the people who built it? We have no written language from this period, no names, no myths recorded in their own words. we know them only through the stones they left behind and the animals they carved into them. Creatures that seem chosen not for their usefulness, as livestock might be, but for something else. Predators. Venomous things. Symbols, perhaps, of forces the builders feared, or forces they hoped to align themselves with. What kind of belief system produces a monument like this, built by people who owned nothing, wandered constantly, and yet somehow organized the labor of hundreds to move stones weighing as much as 10 tons? This is where the more speculative voices enter the conversation. Some researchers, working at the fringes of accepted archaeology, have pointed to the astronomical alignments some claim to see in the pillar arrangements. Theories suggesting the site may track the movement of specific stars, or mark the position of a comet impact believed by some to have struck the Earth around 10,900 BC, an event some call the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Mainstream scientists remain deeply divided on whether that impact happened at all, let alone whether it left any trace in stone carved 1,000 years later. Others have gone further still, suggesting the site preserves the memory of a lost civilization predating known history altogether, an idea embraced by popular writers and largely rejected by professional archaeologists, who point out that no supporting evidence for such a civilization has ever surfaced anywhere else on Earth. What can be said with more confidence is this: Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated event. In the years since its discovery, similar sites have begun to emerge across the same region: Karahan Tepe, Nevaluchori, and others, each suggesting that this hillside was not an anomaly, but part of a wider religious world that existed before Sumer, before Akkad, before any of the gods whose names we still remember. A world with its own pantheon, perhaps, its own priesthood, its own cosmology, one that vanished so completely that even its language is lost to us. We are left, then, with stone animals watching an empty circle and a question that refuses to close. What did the builders of Göbekli Tepe believe they were protecting or containing when they chose so deliberately to bury their own temple? And how much more of this early world, if any of it remains, is still waiting beneath the hills we haven't yet thought to dig? A lost language, a vanished priesthood, a belief system so thoroughly erased that we can only reconstruct it from the silence it left behind. This question, what did the earliest peoples believe before their gods had names we remember, does not end at Göbekli Tepe. It resurfaces again, 4,000 years later, in the clay archives of Mesopotamia, in fragments of story that predate the most famous epic to survive from the ancient world. Every student of ancient literature learns of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, the flood, the search for immortality, the epic inscribed on 12 tablets and rediscovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library in the 19th century. It is often introduced as the oldest surviving work of literature on Earth. That claim, however, is not quite accurate, and the gap between what is popularly believed and what the tablets actually show is itself part of the mystery. Beneath the version of Gilgamesh most widely known, the Standard Babylonian edition, compiled around 1200 BC by a scribe named Sinleku Nini, lie older layers entirely. Sumerian poems about a hero called Gilgamesh circulated independently centuries earlier, separate stories that were never originally connected into a single narrative. Some of these fragments push back toward 2100 BC, but even these are not the beginning. They are translations, adaptations, echoes of something older still, oral traditions that existed long before any scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay to record them. What did those earlier stories say? Here, the record grows thin, and the questions multiply. Cuneiform tablets are fragile things. They crack, they crumble, they are looted, misfiled, or simply never excavated at all. For every tablet recovered from the mounds of ancient Nippur or Ur, archaeologists estimate that countless others were lost to time, to war, to the slow erosion of unbaked clay left in the ground for 4,000 years. We are, in a very real sense, reconstructing a library from its ashes, and we do not know how large the original library was. Consider the flood narrative itself. Long before the biblical account of Noah, and even before Gilgamesh's version involving a man named Utnapishtim, an earlier Sumerian text known as the Eridu Genesis describes a king named Ziusudra, who survives a divine flood sent to destroy humanity. The tablet containing this account is damaged, its ending broken away, its full context uncertain. Where did the story of the flood begin? Sumerologists debate whether it originated as pure myth, as a distant folk memory of a genuine catastrophic flood along the Tigris and Euphrates, or as something else entirely, a symbolic narrative whose true meaning has been lost along with the culture that first told it. And there are stranger threads still. Sumerian mythology speaks of the Anunnaki, a class of deities whose role and number shift depending on which text and which era one consults. It speaks of the Abzu, a cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth, home to the god Enki, associated with wisdom, magic, and the shaping of humankind from clay. It speaks of the Me, a set of divine decrees or sacred powers, sometimes described as physical objects that governed civilization itself. Kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, the art of writing, even the making of war. What exactly the Me were, how they were transmitted, why a mere 100 or so of them were said to encompass the entirety of ordered civilization. This remains one of the more genuinely puzzling aspects of Sumerian religious thought, and scholars today still debate the term's precise meaning. Mainstream Assyriology treats these myths as the product of a sophisticated, literate agricultural society working to explain its world, the flood, kingship, mortality, the relationship between humanity and its gods. That explanation accounts for a great deal, but it does not fully explain why so many of these motifs, a catastrophic flood, a semi-divine hero seeking eternal life, a garden associated with wisdom and its loss, echo across cultures with no clear line of contact between them. Coincidence of the human imagination confronting the same fears, diffusion through trade routes and migration we have not yet fully mapped, or, as more speculative researchers have proposed, with far less consensus behind them, evidence of a shared ancestral memory reaching back further than any civilization we have yet identified. There is also the question of what came before the Sumerians told these stories at all. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It belongs to no known language family, living or dead. It arrived in the historical record already complex, already capable of expressing abstract theology, already equipped with a scribal tradition remarkably advanced for its earliest appearances around 3400 BC. Where did it come from? Who spoke the words before the words were written down? On this, the clay tablets are silent, and so, for now, are we. Perhaps that silence is the point. Perhaps every fragment recovered from the mounds of southern Iraq is a single sentence torn from a much longer story. A story with a beginning we may never locate, told by people whose names did not survive, about gods whose worship ended before history as we define it had properly begun. What, then, is truly the oldest story ever told? And how much of it, the flood, the garden, the search for a life that does not end, did we inherit not from any single civilization, but from something further back, something none of our libraries, buried or otherwise, has yet managed to preserve? In a storage drawer at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, wrapped in cotton and catalogued decades ago, sits a small clay figure no taller than a human hand. It has the body of a woman, seated, dignified in posture. But where her face should be, there is instead the elongated reptilian head of a lizard, with two slanted eyes and a jaw carrying the faint suggestion of a snout. Archaeologists call this a group of artifacts the Ubaid lizard figurines, small clay statuettes, some cradling infants with matching reptilian faces, excavated from graves at Ur and Eridu, dated to roughly 4000 BC. They are among the oldest religious objects ever recovered from Mesopotamian soil, older than Sumerian civilization as it is conventionally understood, older than the written language that would later record the myths of Enki and Ziusudra. They come from a culture that existed before the gods we think we know. The Ubaid period takes its name from a low, unassuming mound in southern Iraq, first excavated in the early 20th century. It spans roughly from 6500 to 3800 BC, a vast stretch of time about which we know comparatively little, precisely because it left us no writing at all. What it left instead is pottery, painted in confident geometric patterns, and settlements arranged around temples, because these people were already building shrines, structures that would be rebuilt and enlarged on the same sacred ground for thousands of years, eventually forming the foundations beneath temples dedicated to gods like Enki at Eridu. The devotion, it seems, came first. The names came later. So, who were the Ubaid people praying to, and why lizards? Mainstream archaeology offers a range of careful, evidence-based explanations. Some scholars suggest the figurines represent an early mother goddess or fertility deity, her reptilian features perhaps symbolic rather than literal, an artistic convention meant to convey something otherworldly, divine, set apart from the merely human. Others point out that similar elongated head and slit-eyed imagery appears across other early artistic traditions, possibly reflecting ritual practices such as head shaping or the wearing of ceremonial masks whose forms became stylized over generations into something else entirely on the potter's wheel. It's also worth noting that some snake and reptile imagery in the ancient Near East carried associations with wisdom, healing, or the underworld, associations that would persist, in altered forms, for millennia afterward in later Mesopotamian and even neighboring religious traditions. But explanation does not equal certainty, and the discomfort these objects provoke has never fully settled. Why are so many of them found deliberately placed in graves, arranged with what appears to be careful intention rather than incidental burial? Why do the infant figures share the same reptilian features as the adults holding them? Suggesting not a mask worn temporarily, but an identity considered permanent, inherited, perhaps believed to continue into the afterlife. What were the Ubaid people trying to say about what a human being actually was, or could become, or once had been? This is the point in the story where the mainstream and the fringe part weighs most sharply. Since the figurines' rediscovery, some outside conventional archaeology have proposed far more speculative readings, that the lizard-headed figures preserve the memory of contact with a non-human intelligence, or represent priesthoods who believed themselves descended from reptilian ancestors. Ideas that echo, whether by coincidence or influence, later folklore found in cultures with no documented connection to the Ubaid at all. Professional archaeologists and Assyriologists overwhelmingly reject these interpretations, and the evidentiary gap between them and the mainstream reading is enormous. But the persistence of the theories, however fringe, points to something real. The Ubaid figurines resist easy closure. They sit in that narrow space between what the evidence supports and what the evidence cannot yet rule out. And it is precisely that space where mystery survives. What we can say with confidence is this: before Enki, before Enlil, before any god whose name and story would eventually be pressed into cuneiform and preserved for us to read, there was already a religious impulse in Mesopotamia. Already a sense of the sacred, already burial rites, already images crafted with obvious care to represent something beyond the ordinary human form. The Ubaid culture built the platforms upon which later temples would rise, quite literally, layer upon layer of mud brick, each generation building its shrine atop the last, until the mound at Eridu became, according to Sumerian tradition itself, the very first city where kingship descended from heaven. Did the Sumerians who later worshipped Enki at that site know whose god had stood there first? Did they inherit a belief, a memory, or only a place, the ground itself carrying a sanctity whose original meaning had already been lost to them, just as it is lost to us? The small clay figure in its drawer in Baghdad offers no answer. It simply watches, as it has watched for 6,000 years, with eyes that were never meant to be entirely human, and waits perhaps for someone to finally understand what its makers were trying so carefully to say. Picture a scribe's hand, some 5,000 years ago, pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. The marks it leaves are wedge-shaped, angular, and by 3200 BC they have become something the world had never seen before: writing. Cuneiform, the first true script in human history, born at Uruk, the great Sumerian city on the Euphrates. This much is settled fact, taught in every introductory course on the ancient Near East. And yet the closer scholars look at the language itself, the stranger the picture becomes. Sumerian, as noted before, is a language isolate, related to nothing else ever recorded, living or dead. That alone is unusual, but not unprecedented. A handful of isolated languages exist in the modern world too. What troubles linguists more is something buried inside Sumerian itself: a layer of place names and technical vocabulary, words for certain rivers, certain occupations, certain crafts that do not fit Sumerian's own grammar or sound patterns. In the early 20th century, the German Assyriologist Benno Landsberger identified this substrate and proposed that it belonged to an earlier, unknown language he termed Proto-Euphratean, spoken by a people who occupied southern Mesopotamia before the Sumerians arrived, or before Sumerian culture as we recognize it fully crystallized. Who were they? Here the certainty of the written record simply ends, because by definition, a people who left no decipherable writing of their own can only be glimpsed through the shadow they cast on those who came after. We know them only secondhand, through the words that a later, literate civilization apparently borrowed and never fully explained. Consider the city names themselves: Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Kish. Some linguists have suggested these names may not be Sumerian words at all, but inherited labels for places that were already old, already named, by the time Sumerian speakers began recording their world in clay. If true, this would mean that the very geography of what we call the cradle of civilization was mapped and christened by someone else first, a people whose language vanished so completely that not a single sentence of it survives, only fossilized fragments embedded like insects in amber within a tongue that replaced it. Mainstream archaeology approaches this cautiously, and for good reason. The Proto-Euphratean hypothesis remains genuinely contested. Not all Assyriologists accept that the substrate evidence is strong enough to prove a distinct pre-Sumerian language, and some argue the anomalies can be explained through internal shifts within Sumerian itself, or through contact with neighboring Semitic and Elamite-speaking populations whose presence in the region is much better attested. The scholarly consensus, such as it is, leans toward caution. Something unusual sits beneath Sumerian vocabulary, but reconstructing an entire lost civilization from a handful of orphaned words is a considerable leap, and most specialists are unwilling to make it without firmer evidence. And yet, the archaeological record does show that the transition into Sumerian civilization was not a clean beginning carved from empty ground. The Ubaid culture, already understood as a religious and architectural foundation for what followed, gives way to what archaeologists call the Uruk period. But the change is gradual, layered, continuous, not a sudden arrival of a new people onto an empty landscape. Pottery styles shift slowly. Settlement patterns evolve rather than reset. Whoever came before, if they were a truly distinct people at all, seemed to have been absorbed rather than erased. Their labor, their irrigation knowledge, perhaps their gods, folded quietly into the civilization that succeeded them, remembered only in fragments too small to reconstruct a face, a name, a story. It's at this edge of the evidence where more speculative voices step in, proposing everything from an entirely separate advanced culture that ceded Sumerian achievement in writing, astronomy, and mathematics, to broader claims of a lost antediluvian civilization referenced obliquely in later Mesopotamian king lists, which describe implausibly long reigns for rulers said to have governed before the flood. Mainstream historians generally read those king lists as symbolic or politically motivated exaggerations rather than literal history, and the vast majority of Assyriologists find no credible evidence for a lost high civilization preceding the Ubaid. But the debate persists in part because the documented mystery, the substrate language, the unexplained place names, is real, verifiable, and still not fully resolved even by conventional scholarship, leaving just enough uncertainty for speculation to take root in the margins. What remains in the end is a linguistic echo without a speaker. A handful of words, the names of rivers, the names of ancient towns, outliving the mouths that first shaped them by thousands of years, carried forward unknowingly by the very civilization that eclipsed them. Sumer became the wonder of the ancient world, its writing, its law, its temples, its gods. But if Landsberger and those who followed him are right, even Sumer itself may have been built, quite literally, on someone else's foundation, in someone else's words. Whose river was the Euphrates first? Whose city stood at Eridu before Eridu had that name? And what does it mean that the so-called birthplace of civilization may not, after all, have been where civilization actually began? Every mystery we've traced so far shares a single, quiet frustration. We are always arriving after the fact. After the temple was buried, after the language died, after the city was built atop what came before. But there is one category of loss more absolute than any we've examined yet. Not a lost people, or a lost word, but a lost story. A tale once told aloud, around a fire or a shrine, that simply stopped being told and vanished before anyone thought to write it down at all. Consider, for a moment, the pyramid texts of Saqqara, not Mesopotamian this time, but Egyptian, carved into the burial chamber walls of the pharaoh Unas around 2350 BC. They are the oldest known religious writings from Egypt, a collection of spells, hymns, and utterances meant to guide the king safely into the afterlife. What strikes Egyptologists most, reading them closely, is how little they explain. The texts speak with total confidence of beings, places, and events that require no introduction to their intended audience. A serpent named in passing, a ferryman who demands answers to riddles whose questions and correct responses are given, but whose deeper meaning is simply assumed to be understood. These are not the earliest tellings of these stories. They are late invocations of a mythology already ancient, already so familiar to its scribes that no one thought to explain what, to us, needs badly to be explained. This same pattern recurs across nearly every ancient literate culture we have any record of. The written myths we possess, Sumerian, Egyptian, Akkadian, later Greek, are almost never the first tellings. They are the last surviving iterations of oral traditions that had already been circulating, changing, fragmenting, and consolidating for centuries or millennia beforehand. Folklorists and historians of religion generally accept this as simply the nature of oral culture. Stories evolve constantly in the telling, and only a fraction are ever fixed in a durable form, at a single moment, by someone who happens to also possess the technology of writing. Everything before that moment is, by definition, unrecoverable in its original form. But how much, precisely, is everything? This is where the question becomes genuinely difficult to answer, because it cannot be answered from what survives, only estimated from what we know about oral societies elsewhere. Anthropological studies of cultures with strong oral storytelling traditions suggest that mythic material can persist, in altered form, for many centuries before ever being recorded. If similar timescales applied to the peoples of the ancient Near East, the deities and demons who make brief, unexplained cameos in the earliest Sumerian and Egyptian texts may represent the final echo of belief systems stretching back not centuries before writing, but millennia. There are tantalizing hints of what some of these earlier beings might have looked like. Lamashtu, a demon in later Mesopotamian belief associated with danger to infants and mothers, appears already fully formed in the earliest texts that mention her, complete with a specific iconography: a lion's head, a bird's talons, suckling a pig and a dog. Where did such a specific, strange image originate? Pazuzu, the wind demon later famous through modern popular culture, carries similarly elaborate imagery from his earliest known depictions. These are not simple, developing ideas. They arrive in the record already complex, already carrying the weight of a tradition with real depth behind it, a tradition we can only see the tip of. Mainstream scholars of comparative religion and folklore generally treat this as an expected and unremarkable feature of how mythology works. Complexity accumulates gradually over unrecorded generations, and what survives in writing is simply a late snapshot of a much longer, invisible development. There is nothing inherently mysterious about a story having deep roots, and yet the specific content of what has been lost remains, by definition, entirely unknown to us, which leaves an open space that more speculative thinkers have long been drawn to fill. Some have proposed that certain recurring mythic figures across unrelated ancient cultures, winged beings, flood-bringing serpents, divine messengers who move between worlds, hint at a shared prehistoric mythology far older than any civilization we can currently identify, though mainstream scholars generally attribute such similarities to universal features of human psychology and experience, rather than a common ancestral source. Others have wondered whether ritual practices themselves, certain gestures, certain configurations of stone or clay found across sites separated by vast distances, might preserve in physical form elements of a story whose words have been completely severed from the actions that once accompanied them. We are left, then, with fragments upon fragments, a demon's face without her full story, a spell whose full meaning requires knowledge lost before the spell was ever carved into stone. Every myth we can read is, in some sense, a final chapter, the last surviving page of a book whose earlier chapters were never written down at all. What stories, then, were being told around fires and altars 10,000 years ago, long before anyone thought to press them into clay or carve them into a tomb wall? And is it possible that fragments of those first stories are still speaking to us today, disguised in myths we think we already understand, long before any of the demons or half-remembered myths we've just traced ever took the shape we recognize? One particular sentence appears at the very opening of a document scholars call the Sumerian king list. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The tablet itself, the most complete copy, was compiled around 1800 BC, though the tradition it records is understood to be older. Reads at first like straightforward political record-keeping. A list of cities, a list of kings, the reigns assigned to each. But that opening line is not a metaphor easily dismissed. Kingship descended. Naught was invented, naught was earned in battle. It came down, as though authority itself were a physical thing, lowered from somewhere above onto a chosen city, onto a chosen man. This is not an isolated turn of phrase. Across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Mesopotamian religious texts, divine authority is repeatedly described not as something humans built or claimed, but as something that arrived, descending, being handed down, being brought from the heavens to a specific place at a specific moment. The Me, those mysterious divine decrees discussed earlier that were said to govern the fundamentals of civilization, were themselves described in myth as objects that could be physically transported. In the story of Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu, gets the god Enki drunk, and persuades him to hand over the Me to her outright, after which she loads them onto her boat of heaven and carries them to her own city of Uruk. Civilization itself, in this telling, is cargo. Something that comes from one place is carried through the sky or across water and is delivered to another. Mainstream historians of religion read these traditions through a fairly consistent lens, as sacred origin stories, the kind nearly every early civilization constructs to legitimize its institutions. A city claiming that its kingship, its temples, or its laws were divinely delivered rather than humanly invented gains enormous political and religious authority, an unchallengeable pedigree. Anthropologists find comparable descent narratives in unrelated cultures worldwide, which suggests less a specific shared memory and more a common instinct. Societies tend to root power in the heavens because heavenly origins cannot be argued with. That explanation is reasonable, well supported, and accepted by the overwhelming majority of scholars. And yet, certain details in these traditions resist being fully absorbed into the category of simple political myth-making. The king list, after describing kingship's descent to Eridu, goes on to assign to the earliest antediluvian kings reign lengths of staggering, almost incomprehensible length, tens of thousands of years apiece, for a small handful of rulers, before the list abruptly notes that the flood swept over, and kingship descended again, this time to a different city. Why construct a legitimizing myth with numbers so extreme they strain even a Bronze Age audience's willingness to believe? Historians generally treat these figures as symbolic, perhaps tied to numerical or astronomical systems significant to Mesopotamian scribes, rather than intended as literal chronology. But a fully satisfying explanation for the specific numbers chosen has never been agreed upon. Similar descent language appears in Mesopotamian accounts of the ancient sages known as the Apkallu, 7 semi-divine figures said to have brought the arts of civilization to humanity in the earliest days, before the flood, associated with specific antediluvian kings, and often depicted in later Assyrian art as bird-headed or fish-cloaked figures attending to the king. Enki was said to have sent them up from the Abzu, the freshwater deep beneath the earth, to instruct humanity directly. Once again, knowledge and order, arriving from outside, delivered to a waiting population rather than developed by it. It is this recurring architecture, authority and civilization consistently framed as things that descend, that are brought, that are delivered from elsewhere, that has drawn the attention of writers well outside mainstream scholarship, some of whom have proposed, controversially and without support from professional archaeologists or Assyriologists, that these traditions preserve garbled memories of contact with an outside intelligence, mistaken by ancient peoples for gods. This interpretation finds essentially no acceptance within academic Assyriology, which points out that descent from heaven is an exceptionally common motif across human mythology in general, requiring no such explanation. Still, the persistence of the questions is worth noting honestly. Why this specific, repeated insistence across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Mesopotamian texts spanning well over 1,000 years that the foundations of civilization were not built, but brought? Was it simply the most natural way for an early people to explain how order emerged from a world that must have felt, most of the time, dangerously close to chaos? Or does the sheer consistency of the imagery, objects carried in a boat, sages sent up from below, kingship lowered from above, suggest these societies were straining to describe something they themselves no longer fully understood, using the only language available to them? The tablets do not resolve the question. They simply repeat it, generation after generation, city after city, kingship descended. And they leave unanswered the one thing we may never recover. Descended from where, exactly, and why anyone believed so consistently that it had to. Before the sages, before the kings said to have received their office from heaven, before Eridu was even the city its own myths claimed it to be, there were the potters. It is through their work, more than through any king list or sacred text, that we can trace the people archaeologists call the Halaf culture, and through their sudden, unexplained absence that one of northern Mesopotamia's most persistent mysteries begins. Named after Tel Halaf in modern Syria, where the culture was first identified in the early 20th century, the Halaf people flourished across northern Mesopotamia and parts of Anatolia and the Levant from roughly 6100 to 5400 BC. What survives of them is, above all, extraordinarily beautiful. Halaf pottery is considered by many archaeologists among the finest produced anywhere in the prehistoric world. Fine-walled vessels painted with intricate polychrome designs, geometric patterns, stylized bulls, rosettes, and human figures rendered with a confidence and consistency that suggests not scattered village craftsmanship, but something closer to a shared artistic and possibly religious language, understood and reproduced across a strikingly wide territory. That geographic consistency is itself part of the puzzle. Halaf-style pottery appears at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers, all sharing recognizable motifs and techniques, at a time when we would expect regional isolation, not shared visual culture spanning so much of the map. How did a decentralized society of small farming villages, for the Halaf, as far as we can tell, built no great cities, no monumental architecture, no palaces, maintain such a coherent artistic and symbolic identity across such distance? Trade networks certainly existed. Obsidian tools found at Halaf sites have been traced back to sources in Anatolia, confirming exchange over considerable distances. But trade in raw materials is one thing. The transmission of a shared visual language, apparently without centralized authority to enforce or standardize it, is a more delicate question, and archaeologists continue to debate exactly how it happened. The religious life of the Halaf people is glimpsed mainly through two kinds of objects: female figurines, often seated, with exaggerated hips and breasts, generally interpreted as connected to fertility or a mother goddess concept broadly similar to figures found across the wider Neolithic Near East, and circular buildings called tholoi, structures with a domed or beehive-shaped roofline whose exact function, domestic, ceremonial, storage, or some combination, remains debated. Were the tholoi shrines? Granaries? Something that served both purposes at once, in a worldview that did not draw the same sharp line between the sacred and the practical that we tend to draw today? The structures themselves offer no explanation, only their careful, repeated shape, built the same way across the culture's entire span. And then, around 5400 BC, the Halaf culture disappears from the archaeological record, not violently, as far as excavation has been able to determine, with no widespread evidence of destruction layers or conflict marking a sudden end. It simply gives way, over a relatively short span, to what archaeologists call the Northern Ubaid expansion, as Ubaid-style pottery and settlement patterns, the same Ubaid culture already encountered further south at Eridu, spread northward and gradually replace Halaf material culture across the same territory. The mainstream interpretation treats this as a case of cultural assimilation rather than a genuine mystery. Two neighboring Neolithic populations in contact through trade, intermarriage, and shared technology gradually merging, with the more expansive Ubaid cultural package simply proving more successful or more attractive over time, absorbing Halaf communities rather than eliminating them. This is broadly consistent with how cultural transitions elsewhere in prehistory are understood to have worked, and most archaeologists find nothing about the Halaf to Ubaid transition that requires a more dramatic explanation. Population genetics, where it has been studied at all in this deep a time period, offers limited additional clarity, and the archaeological transition itself, though relatively rapid, is not unusually so by prehistoric standards. Still, certain questions resist full closure. Why does such a materially rich, artistically ambitious culture leave behind no discernible descendant tradition in its distinctive painted style? No gradual softening of Halaf motifs into Ubaid ones, but instead something closer to a comparatively swift replacement. Did the elaborate visual and religious language encoded in Halaf pottery carry meanings that simply held no currency for the incoming Ubaid tradition, and were therefore abandoned rather than adapted? Or does the neat, tidy narrative of assimilation smooth over a more turbulent, poorly preserved reality? Climate pressures, resource competition, or social upheaval that current excavation has not yet uncovered enough evidence to fully reconstruct. We know the names the Halaf people gave to none of their gods. We do not know what the seated women with their careful, exaggerated forms were meant to represent, or protect, or invoke. We know only that for roughly 7 centuries, across a landscape stretching from the Levant to the edges of Anatolia, communities that may never have met one another still painted their pottery in a common visual dialect, and then, within a few generations, stopped. What precisely was lost when the Halaf style disappeared from the archaeological record? And is it possible that somewhere beneath a still unexcavated mound, the fuller answer to how and why this widespread distinctive culture came to an end is simply waiting to be uncovered? Follow the Euphrates north from the mudflats of Eridu, past the ruins of vanished Halaf villages, and the river itself seems to answer a question we have not yet finished asking. Whose word for river was this, originally? Sumerian speakers called it Buranun. The Akkadians who came after adapted it to Puratu, and from there, through Old Persian and Greek, it eventually reaches us as Euphrates. But linguists studying the earliest layer of this name have long suspected that even Buranun is not a native Sumerian word, that the Sumerians themselves inherited it from someone else, the way English speakers today use Mississippi or Ohio, without speaking a word of the indigenous languages those names came from. This is the quiet puzzle sitting at the root of Mesopotamian civilization, the language that gave the region its rivers, several of its oldest cities, and a cluster of specialized vocabulary may not have been Sumerian at all. Scholars refer to it, tentatively, as a substrate language, evidence of speech that existed before Sumerian, buried inside it the way an older building's foundation sometimes survives beneath a newer one, invisible until someone starts digging in the right place. The case rests on a specific narrow category of evidence. Certain Sumerian words associated with agriculture, irrigation, and particular skilled trades, plow-related terminology, some metalworking vocabulary, a handful of occupational titles, do not follow the regular sound patterns and grammatical logic found elsewhere in the Sumerian language. To a trained linguist, this kind of irregularity is often a telltale sign of borrowing, a word absorbed wholesale from a different language, carrying its foreign shape along with it, the way sushi or kayak sit slightly apart from the native vocabulary of English. The German Assyriologist Benno Landsberger was among the first to systematically catalog these irregularities in the early 20th century, and the substrate hypothesis built on his work has remained a live, if unresolved, question in the field ever since. What makes this more than an academic curiosity is what the borrowed vocabulary seems to describe. Not abstract or ceremonial concepts, but practical, technical knowledge. Farming, digging canals, working metal. If the hypothesis holds, it suggests the Sumerians did not invent these skills from nothing upon settling southern Mesopotamia. They may have learned them, along with the words for them, from a population already established there, already familiar with the demanding, engineered agriculture that the marshy floodplain required. Who were these people? This is precisely where the evidence runs out. No inscriptions in their language have ever been found, because, if they existed as a distinct linguistic group at all, they left the region, or the written record, before writing itself was invented. Everything we can say about them is inference, built entirely on the shape of the words their successors kept using. Some researchers have proposed connecting this substrate population to the Ubaid culture already explored in this history. The same people whose lizard-headed figurines and temple platforms predate Sumerian religious life by well over 1,000 years. If the Ubaid people spoke this lost tongue, then their disappearance from the archaeological record as a distinct culture may parallel their disappearance from the linguistic one, not through conquest or catastrophe, but through the slow, ordinary process by which one language quietly overtakes another over the span of a few centuries. This remains, it should be said plainly, a contested position within Assyriology. A meaningful number of specialists question whether the irregular vocabulary truly points to a single lost language at all, suggesting instead that it might reflect internal changes within Sumerian, regional dialects, or contact with the Semitic and Elamite languages already known to have existed in the wider region. The debate has continued for over a century without full resolution, largely because the central piece of evidence anyone would need, an actual text in this hypothetical language, has never surfaced, and may never surface at all. It is this absence of a smoking gun that has left room for bolder speculation at the field's fringes. Suggestions of a far more developed pre-Sumerian society, one whose accomplishments have been almost entirely erased from memory, surviving only in a handful of orphaned words. Mainstream scholarship finds little to support such an expansive claim, and is careful to note that a linguistic substrate, however real, is modest evidence. It points to an earlier population, not necessarily an advanced or mysterious one. What is left, when the theories are set aside, is a genuinely strange and enduring fact. The Sumerians, inventors of writing, architects of the first cities, may have spoken a tongue laced with borrowed words for the very techniques that made their civilization possible. Inherited from people whose name for themselves, whose stories and whose voice have been gone for so long that even the ground they once irrigated no longer remembers the sound of them. If a single sentence of that first language could somehow be recovered, what would it tell us? And how much of what we call the beginning of civilization would need to be renamed? If a single sentence of that lost tongue could ever be recovered, it would join a small, strange category of historical evidence, testimony about a people that exists only in someone else's words. And Mesopotamia offers no better example of this than a name that appears again and again across 1,000 years of cuneiform record, attached to no ruins we can confidently point to, no language we can read, no self-description at all, only ever mentioned by outsiders. That name is Subartu. References to Subartu, and to a people the texts call Sumerians, appear scattered across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Assyrian sources beginning as early as the 3rd millennium BC and continuing for well over 1,000 years afterward. Kings boast of campaigning against Subartu. Trade texts mention goods arriving from it. Geographic lists place it somewhere to the north of Sumer and Akkad, generally associated with the upper reaches of Mesopotamia and the foothills beyond, in the region of the Kabur and Upper Tigris. And yet, in all that time, across all those centuries of reference, not a single text has ever been found that we can confidently say was written by the Sumerians themselves, in their own words, about their own land. Everything we know about them, in other words, comes filtered through the eyes, and often the swords, of their neighbors. We know that Sargon of Akkad, in the 24th century BC, claimed victory over Subartu among his conquests. We know later Assyrian rulers, centuries afterward, continued to use the term for territories and peoples to their north, though by then it may have shifted to mean something closer to a general geographic label than a specific ethnic identity, the way the frontier might mean different actual places depending on when and who is speaking. This drift itself is part of the puzzle. Was Subartu, at its earliest mention, a specific, identifiable people with their own language and culture? Or was it always something closer to a direction, a vague designation for the peoples north of us, applied loosely to whoever happened to occupy that space at a given moment? Mainstream Assyriology leans toward caution here, and for defensible reasons. Ancient states frequently used geographic or directional terms for foreign populations without much ethnographic precision, the way Greek writers later lumped a vast range of non-Greek peoples under the single label barbarian. It is entirely possible that Subartu functioned similarly, less a discrete civilization awaiting rediscovery, and more a shifting frontier concept applied by Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians alike to different groups across different centuries, none of whom necessarily shared a language, a government, or a common identity with one another at all. And yet, certain scholars have pushed back gently against fully dissolving Subartu into vague geography. Some linguists have proposed connecting the Sumerian name to Hurrian, a genuine, well-attested ancient language of the region, related to Urartian, and eventually documented in its own right through the later archives at sites like Nutsi and in the Hurrian Hittite bilingual texts of the 2nd millennium BC. If Subartu does correspond, even loosely, to early Hurrian-speaking populations, then we may in fact be looking at one edge of a real, definable culture, one that only enters legible history centuries after Sumerian and Akkadian scribes had already been referring to Subartu as a place on the map for a very long time. The timeline, however, does not close cleanly. The earliest Subartu references significantly predate any confirmed Hurrian textual evidence, leaving a substantial gap that the identification does not fully bridge. What makes this case distinct from the earlier substrate language mystery is not the absence of evidence but the peculiar shape of what evidence exists. Abundant but entirely second-hand, we have more mentions of Subartu across Mesopotamian history than we have of many well-documented ancient peoples, and yet every one of those mentions comes from the outside, filtered through the political and cultural assumptions of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian scribes who had their own reasons, often military or economic, for referencing the lands and peoples beyond their northern frontier. It is rather like trying to reconstruct a person's entire life using only the things their rivals said about them. Perhaps that is simply the nature of frontier zones in the ancient world, named constantly, understood rarely, defined more by what a more literate neighbor needed them to represent than by anything approaching self-testimony. Or perhaps, somewhere in the unexcavated mounds of the Upper Kabur and the hill country beyond, there remains a Sumerian text still waiting to be found, one written not about this people but by them, in a voice history has so far only ever heard secondhand. If such a text exists, what would it finally tell us about a name repeated for over 1,000 years by people who were never the ones being described? And how many other Subardis, peoples mentioned constantly, understood barely, and never once permitted to speak for themselves, remain scattered across the record we call ancient history? Some hundreds of kilometers from the frontier lands of Subartu, where an entire people is known to us only through the words of their neighbors, a different kind of second-hand record was taking shape at Uruk. One so small and so unassuming that its true significance would not be understood for thousands of years. A clay token no larger than a fingertip, shaped like a cone. Archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat, tracing the deep prehistory of accounting across the Near East, followed tokens like this one back as far as 8000 BC, simple clay shapes, cones, spheres, discs, used across the region to represent quantities of goods. A jar of oil, a measure of grain. For millennia, these tokens functioned as a kind of physical bookkeeping, sometimes sealed inside hollow clay envelopes so that a transaction or a debt could be recorded and verified later. And then, at Uruk, around 3200 BC, something changed. Someone pressed the tokens into the outer surface of the envelope before sealing it, so the contents could be read from the outside without breaking the seal open. Eventually, Schmant-Besserat argued, the logical next step arrived. If the impressed marks told you everything, the tokens inside became unnecessary. Flatten the envelope into a tablet, and writing in its earliest form was essentially born. It is a remarkably unglamorous origin story for one of the most transformative inventions in human history. Not a divine gift, not a singular flash of genius. The slow, practical evolution of an accounting system, driven by the demands of an increasingly complex temple economy that could no longer rely on memory alone to track its resources. The tablets recovered from early Uruk bear this out. Thousands of them survive, and the overwhelming majority are not stories, prayers, or royal proclamations. They are administrative records, tallies of barley, livestock, and labor, kept by the temple institutions that governed the city's economy. Writing, it seems, began not as literature, but as inventory. And yet, within this well-supported account, genuine questions remain unresolved. The leap from simple impressed tokens to a true, flexible writing system, one capable of recording not just quantities of grain, but names, grammar, and eventually myth and history, did not happen instantly. The earliest Uruk tablets are almost entirely numerical. It takes further centuries before cuneiform develops the capacity to record connected language at all, and archaeologists still debate exactly how and how quickly that further transformation occurred. What carried a counting system across the threshold into genuine written language remains far less settled than the origin of the tokens themselves. There is also the broader puzzle of independent invention. Writing systems are known to have emerged separately in a small number of places across the ancient world, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica among them, apparently without direct contact between most of these traditions. Mainstream scholars generally treat this as a case of convergent cultural evolution. Complex societies facing similar administrative pressures arriving, independently, at broadly similar solutions. But broadly similar conceals real variation in how, and how quickly, each system developed. And the deeper question of why writing emerges precisely when and where it does, and not in other comparably complex societies, remains only partially answered. It is in this gap that more speculative voices have entered the conversation. Some fringe theories propose that Mesopotamian writing developed with implausible speed, or reflects knowledge inherited from an earlier, unidentified source, echoing, in new form, the same substrate language and Ubaid questions already raised earlier in this history. Mainstream archaeologists and epigraphers find little to support these claims, pointing to the token record as a slow, visible, well-documented developmental path that requires no outside explanation. But the persistence of such theories reflects something real. The archaeological record shows the mechanism with reasonable clarity, yet cannot fully explain the human decision itself. The precise instant someone in Uruk looked at a mark pressed into wet clay and understood for the first time that it could represent not merely an object, but a word, a name, a sound. Whoever that person was, they left no signature behind. The earliest tablets record grain and sheep, not the identity of the mind that first grasped what clay could hold. We can trace the system in careful, patient detail. We cannot locate the moment or the individual in which counting quietly became writing. The moment thought first found a way to outlive the person who thought it. What, then, was lost in that transition? What ideas, prayers, and stories existed only in memory in the years just before writing began, carried in the minds of people who never knew a tablet could hold them, and who vanished, along with everything they knew, into the silence just beyond where any record was ever pressed to reach? Among the earliest tablets recovered from Uruk, the ones recording grain and sheep, pressed by a hand history never named, a small number carry something different. A single recurring symbol, a stylized figure seated, sometimes wearing a distinctive net-patterned skirt, sometimes holding what appears to be a staff. Scholars call this figure the priest-king, and this seal image, repeated across dozens of artifacts from Uruk and beyond, may be our first glimpse of political and religious authority united in a single human form. The image appears not just on clay tablets, but carved into cylinder seals, etched onto the famous Uruk vase, and worked into fragments of relief sculpture. Always the same bearded figure, always in the same net skirt, always engaged in acts that blend the sacred and the administrative. Feeding sacred flocks, presenting offerings to a goddess, subduing lions with his bare hands. He appears with such consistency across Uruk period art, roughly 3300 to 3000 BC, that archaeologists have concluded he represents not one man remembered by name, but an office, a role, repeated and reproduced in art, whoever happened to occupy it at a given time. And that, precisely, is where the certainty ends. We do not know his name. Not one of these figures' many appearances is accompanied by an inscription identifying who he was. This is a genuinely strange silence, given how quickly Mesopotamian rulers elsewhere begin recording their names, their titles, their genealogies once writing matures. The priest king of Uruk predates that naming convention, or exists just at its threshold, visible in image, invisible in word. Mainstream archaeology reads him as the natural culmination of the religious authority we've already traced through this history. The temple-centered devotion, first seen at Göbekli Tepe, the shrine platforms of Ubaid Eridu, all converging by the late 4th millennium BC into a single office, holding both religious and secular power simultaneously. This figure, many scholars argue, was likely the Anu, a Sumerian title later attested in written sources, denoting a high priest or ruler with responsibilities spanning temple administration, agricultural oversight, and possibly military leadership. If so, the priest-king seal imagery may capture the moment when scattered temple authority consolidated into something resembling true kingship, tightening its grip on Uruk's rapidly growing population. But why does this consolidation of power leave behind an image with no name at all? Some scholars propose the office itself was considered sacred to such a degree that specific individuals were deliberately de-emphasized, that what mattered to Uruk's artists and scribes was the role's continuity, not the mortal, temporary body who happened to fill it. Others suggest simply that naming conventions in art had not yet developed alongside the pictographic writing system, and that we are looking at an early stage of representation, not a deliberate erasure. The Uruk vase complicates the picture further. Carved from alabaster and standing over a meter tall, it depicts a procession, animals, plants, and then, in its uppermost register, a partially preserved scene showing offerings brought before a figure believed to represent the goddess Inanna, with the priest-king apparently present nearby, his exact posture and role obscured by damage to the stone. The vase suggests a formal, ritualized relationship between this human office and Uruk's patron deity, but the specific nature of that relationship, whether the priest-king claimed to represent Inanna, serve her, or something closer to a symbolic marriage to her, remains genuinely debated, and the damaged sections of the vase leave key details permanently out of reach. It is here that more speculative interpretations arise. Some researchers outside the mainstream have proposed that this unnamed priest-king represents not an office at all, but a specific historical figure so significant that later tradition folded him into myth, a possible echo, however indirect and unproven, of the legendary rulers described in the Sumerian king list's earliest, most fantastical entries. Mainstream Assyriologists remain skeptical of drawing a direct line between the anonymous seal imagery and any specific king list figure, noting the chronological and evidentiary gaps involved. Still, the coincidence is not nothing. An office defined by religious and political authority together, emerging at precisely the moment writing itself was being invented, just as later tradition would describe kingship descending from heaven to this very city. Was the priest-king simply an administrative title, worn and shed by a succession of ordinary men managing an increasingly complex city? Or does his consistent, careful depiction, always the same skirt, the same posture, the same proximity to the divine, suggest that Uruk's people understood him as something closer to a living conduit between heaven and the growing world of clay tablets and grain stores below? Nearly 7 centuries of Uruk period art return again and again to this same unnamed face. What did the people who carved him believe they were preserving? A man, an office, or something they no longer had the words to fully describe? 2 centuries would pass before the unnamed priest-king's image stopped appearing on Uruk's seals. And in that same span, something far larger than any single office was quietly taking shape across the whole of southern Mesopotamia. An explosion of record-keeping so sudden and so total that archaeologists still struggle to fully explain its pace. By around 3100 BC, barely a century after the first pictographic tablets appeared at Uruk, the sheer volume of written material being produced across the region had multiplied dramatically. Thousands of tablets survive from this narrow window alone. Inventories, ration lists, labor rosters, land records, temple accounts, a documentary explosion covering nearly every category of economic and administrative life a growing city could generate. What had begun, as we've seen, as a modest solution to a bookkeeping problem had, within a handful of generations, become something close to a reflex, an instinct to record, count, and preserve that spread through Uruk's institutions with startling speed. Why did this happen so quickly? The mainstream explanation points to scale. Uruk, by this period, may have housed a population in the tens of thousands, making it among the largest urban settlements the world had yet produced. A city of that size, organized around centralized temple economies redistributing grain, labor, and goods across a sprawling population, generates a volume of transactions that human memory simply cannot track reliably. Once the technology of writing existed at all, the pressure to expand its use across every administrative domain would have been immense, and archaeologists generally see the rapid spread of tablets as a natural, almost inevitable response to that pressure. Supply meeting a demand that had been building for centuries. This account is well supported by the tablets themselves, which show a clear trajectory. An increasing standardization of sign forms, more consistent numerical notation, and an expanding vocabulary of recorded categories, all within a remarkably compressed time frame. What's harder to explain is the texture of what wasn't being recorded. For a documentary explosion this large, myth, prayer, personal reflection, and narrative remain almost entirely absent for centuries longer. Sumerian literature as we recognize it, hymns, epics, wisdom texts, does not appear in any developed form until nearly 1,000 years after the first Uruk tablets. Why did a civilization capable of building such a comprehensive administrative apparatus wait so long to use the same tool for anything resembling storytelling or belief? Some scholars argue this simply reflects institutional priority. Writing belonged, in its earliest centuries, almost exclusively to temple and palace bureaucracies, trained scribes serving practical economic functions, with neither the incentive nor perhaps the linguistic flexibility yet to record connected prose. Others point to the technical limitation of the script itself during this period. Early cuneiform was heavily pictographic and numerical, better suited to recording discrete quantities of goods than to capturing the grammar and nuance of spoken language, a capability that had to be developed gradually, sign by sign, before literature became possible at all. There is also a demographic and political dimension worth considering. This same era, the transition from the 4th into the 3rd millennium BC, coincides with the broader consolidation of Sumerian city-states, increasing competition and conflict between them, and the gradual crystallization of hereditary kingship, the very kind of authority the Sumerian king list would later claim had descended from heaven. Some historians suggest that the explosive growth in record-keeping was not simply a response to administrative necessity, but part of a broader transformation in how power itself was organized and legitimized. A society learning in real time that written record could serve not just as memory, but as proof, as claim, as a tool of control every bit as significant as a city wall or a temple platform. It's at this edge that more speculative interpretations occasionally surface. Proposals that the rapid, almost unprecedented speed of this administrative explosion suggests knowledge transmitted from elsewhere, or an external catalyst not yet identified in the archaeological record. Mainstream scholars generally find this unnecessary, arguing that the token-to-tablet trajectory already discussed provides a sufficient, well-evidenced explanation for the pace of change, however striking that pace may look in hindsight. Still, the sheer compression of the timeline, a leap from scattered clay tokens to a fully functioning bureaucratic writing system across only a few centuries, remains one of the more genuinely remarkable accelerations in the whole of human technological history, and historians continue to debate exactly which social, economic, and political pressures aligned to produce it. What is certain is this: for the first time, a civilization began leaving behind a continuous, dated record of its own daily transactions, at a scale no earlier society had attempted. And yet even amid that flood of counted grain and tallied labor, the inner life of the people producing it, their fears, their prayers, their private losses, remained, for centuries longer, entirely unrecorded. What might we know of the earliest Uruk citizens, if only their instinct to preserve had turned toward memory as quickly and thoroughly as it turned toward grain? Imagine standing in the mud-brick ruins of Eridu at dawn, before excavation ever touched them. The smell of dry silt, the flat white glare of the southern Mesopotamian sun rising over what was once, according to Sumerian tradition, the very first city on earth. Beneath your feet, invisible from the surface, lie 18 layers of temples, stacked one atop the next across nearly 5,000 years of continuous rebuilding, each generation tearing down, leveling, and raising a new shrine on precisely the same sacred ground their ancestors had chosen. This is Eridu's Temple of Enki, though calling it a single temple undersells what excavation actually revealed. The earliest layer, dated to roughly 5400 BC, was startlingly modest. A small room, barely large enough for a handful of worshippers, containing little more than a niche and an offering table. And yet, upon that same modest footprint, level after level, the site was rebuilt continuously for millennia, each new structure growing larger, more elaborate, more architecturally ambitious, until by the height of the Sumerian period, the temple had become a monumental ziggurat platform, one of the most sacred sites in the entire Mesopotamian world. Why here? This is the first, and perhaps the most difficult, question the site raises. Eridu sits at the edge of what was once a marshy lagoon, close to where the Euphrates met the waters of the Persian Gulf in antiquity, a landscape of reeds, fish, and abundant fresh water that Sumerian myth would later associate directly with Enki's own domain, the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean said to lie beneath the earth. Was the location chosen because it already carried some pre-existing sense of the sacred among the region's earliest inhabitants, the same shadowy Ubaid period population whose lizard-headed figurines we explored earlier? Or did the site's mythological significance develop only afterward, layered onto the location gradually, generation by generation, as later worshippers reinterpreted a place their distant ancestors had simply found convenient? Mainstream archaeology tends to favor a gradual, cumulative explanation, and the physical evidence supports it well. Religious sites across many ancient cultures show this same pattern of continuous reuse. Sacredness accruing to a location precisely because it has already been sacred, a kind of self-reinforcing tradition where each generation's investment in a site increases its perceived spiritual weight for the next. Rebuilding directly atop a temple's own foundations, rather than starting fresh elsewhere, may reflect a genuine belief that the ground itself, not merely the structure standing on it, held religious significance. Meaning, the builders were not simply economizing on labor, but deliberately preserving continuity with something they considered sacred in itself. But the sheer duration of this continuity is itself remarkable, and not easily explained by convenience alone. Few religious sites anywhere in the ancient world show unbroken ritual use across a span approaching 5,000 years, predating not only the Sumerian civilization that would eventually claim Eridu as humanity's first city, but predating writing, organized kingship, and nearly every other institution we associate with early civilization. What allowed a single sacred location to retain its significance across such a vast stretch of time, through the rise and fall of the Ubaid culture, through the emergence of Uruk and its unnamed priest kings, through the slow accumulation of writing and bureaucracy already traced through this history? Continuity on this scale suggests either a religious tradition of extraordinary institutional strength or something about the location itself that repeatedly drew human attention back to precisely the same patch of ground, century after century, culture after culture. It is here that more speculative interpretations occasionally arise. Some researchers outside mainstream archaeology have proposed that such extraordinarily long-lived sacred sites may mark locations tied to genuine, if now unrecoverable, prehistoric memory, a real event, a real feature of the ancient landscape, whose significance was preserved through ritual even after its original meaning was lost to the people continuing the tradition. Mainstream scholars generally resist this framing, noting that self-reinforcing religious continuity, once established, requires no additional explanation to persist for millennia. Sacredness, once assigned, tends to sustain itself culturally, regardless of whatever originally inspired it. Still, the question of what first drew human attention to this particular stretch of marshland, before any myth existed to explain the choice, remains genuinely unanswered. Beneath the ziggurat platform that rose in the site's final centuries of use, that first small shrine still lies buried, a single modest room, built by people whose names, language, and beliefs remain almost entirely unknown to us, chosen for reasons no later worshipper ever bothered to record, because by the time writing existed to record it, the reason itself may have already been forgotten. What did the first people who knelt on that ground believe they had found there? And is it possible that the true answer disappeared not in some later catastrophe, but simply in the ordinary, unremarked passage of the earliest centuries no record was ever made to preserve? The worshippers who knelt in that first modest shrine at Eridu left us no names, but they left something else. The residue of what they did there, scattered in ash layers, animal bone, and broken pottery pressed into the temple's earliest floors, the physical debris of ceremony. It is through traces like these, rather than through any text, that archaeologists have tried to reconstruct what the earliest sacred rituals in Mesopotamia may actually have involved, and how much of what we call religion today may descend from practices whose original meaning has been almost entirely lost. The evidence is fragmentary by nature. Ritual, unlike architecture, does not fossilize whole. What survives are the physical byproducts: burned animal bones consistent with sacrificial offerings, fine ash deposits suggesting repeated burning at a temple's central hearth, deliberately broken and buried pottery, and, at various Mesopotamian sites, small clay figurines apparently placed with intention beneath thresholds or foundations. From this material, archaeologists reconstruct ceremonies that likely combined offerings of food and drink, ritual burning, and possibly the recitation of words we have no record of, performed for centuries before any priest ever encoded them into cuneiform. By the time Sumerian texts finally do describe temple ritual in detail, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, the ceremonies described are already elaborate, formalized, and deeply structured. Offerings scheduled to specific days, precise ritual roles assigned to different classes of priests and priestesses, processions carrying divine statues between temples, incantations recited in fixed, memorized sequences. This level of formal structure did not appear overnight. It reflects, most scholars agree, an accumulation of ritual practice stretching back through the unrecorded centuries we've already traced, back through the unnamed priest kings of Uruk, back through the earliest shrine layers at Eridu, back into the Ubaid period and beyond, into a prehistoric religious world for which we have material traces, but no words at all. This raises a genuinely difficult question for anyone trying to understand the earliest Mesopotamian sacred ceremonies. How much of what later texts describe as ancient, correct, divinely ordained ritual practice was actually a faithful continuation of what the earliest worshippers did, and how much was reinterpreted, reshaped, or simply invented by later priesthoods working backward from fragments of a tradition they themselves no longer fully understood? Religious institutions, across many cultures, tend to describe their practices as timeless and unchanging, even when the practices themselves have shifted considerably over generations. Mesopotamian temple ritual, mainstream historians generally suspect, was no exception, a living tradition, constantly adapted, dressed in the language of ancient and unbroken continuity even as its specific content evolved. There are specific puzzles within this larger uncertainty that remain unresolved. Foundation deposits, objects, and in some documented cases, animal remains, buried beneath the walls and thresholds of temples as they were constructed or rebuilt, appear across Mesopotamian sites spanning thousands of years, but their precise ritual purpose is inferred rather than directly recorded in the earliest periods. Were they offerings meant to consecrate the ground, protective measures against unseen threats, a physical symbolic binding of the building to the deity it served? Later Mesopotamian texts do describe foundation rituals explicitly, but whether those later, textually documented practices accurately reflect what earlier, unrecorded builders intended remains a matter of scholarly inference rather than certainty. The recurring presence of animal sacrifice across the archaeological record raises its own set of questions. Burned and butchered animal bone appears consistently at temple sites from the Ubaid period onward, suggesting a ritual practice with genuinely deep roots. But the specific meaning attached to sacrifice, whether it was understood primarily as sustenance offered to a deity, a mechanism for establishing communal bonds among worshippers, a method of divination through the reading of entrails, later well documented in Mesopotamian practice, or some combination that shifted over time, cannot be recovered from bone fragments alone. The physical evidence tells us the practice occurred, repeatedly, for millennia. It cannot tell us, with certainty, what the earliest participants believed they were accomplishing when they performed it. It is in this space, between confirmed physical practice and uncertain meaning, that more speculative interpretations sometimes take root. Proposals that the earliest ceremonies encoded specific astronomical knowledge, or preserved ritual gestures whose true origin and purpose predate even the earliest sites we've explored in this history. Mainstream archaeologists generally urge caution here, noting how easily modern observers project structured, deliberate meaning onto ritual behavior that may have evolved more organically, shaped by centuries of small, unrecorded adjustments rather than any single original design. Yet the caution runs both ways. The formal, highly structured temple ritual, eventually described in Sumerian texts, did not emerge from nothing, and precisely how it emerged, layer by layer, out of the ash and broken pottery of the earliest shrines, remains a genuinely open question in Mesopotamian archaeology. What words, then, were spoken over the fires whose ash still lies packed into Eridu's oldest floors? And how much of what later priesthoods claimed as ancient, sacred tradition was truly inherited from that first ceremony, and how much was simply, quietly invented in its name? The broken pottery, packed into Eridu's oldest floors, was not always left where it fell. At several Mesopotamian sites, archaeologists have found layers where the ordinary debris of ceremony, vessels, figurines, ritual tools, was suddenly and deliberately swept aside, buried, or replaced with an entirely new set of objects, marking a religious transition abrupt enough to be visible in the stratigraphy itself, without a single tablet ever explaining why. These transitions are not rare. Across the long span of Mesopotamian prehistory and early history already traced through this series, sacred practice does not evolve smoothly. It lurches. A pantheon shifts in prominence. A dominant temple cult in one city gives way, sometimes within a generation, to the ascendance of another god entirely. Iconography that had persisted for centuries, think of the Ubaid lizard figurines, or the seated mother goddess forms found across the Halaf world, simply stops appearing in the archaeological record, sometimes replaced by imagery so different in style and subject that archaeologists initially assumed they were looking at the arrival of a wholly new population, rather than a change of belief among people who had never left. Why would an entire culture change what it believed, and how quickly could such a change actually occur? Mainstream archaeology offers several converging explanations, and the evidence supports a combination of all of them depending on the specific case. Political consolidation is one clear driver. As city-states rose and fell in prominence across southern Mesopotamia, the patron deity of a newly dominant city often rose in the wider religious hierarchy alongside it, a pattern visible later and more explicitly when Babylon's ascendance elevated the god Marduk to supremacy in the 2nd millennium BC. Religious change, in cases like this, tracked political change closely, belief realigning itself with the shifting map of earthly power. Environmental pressure offers a second, well-supported explanation. Shifts in the course of the Euphrates, changes in rainfall, or the salinization of overworked agricultural land could undermine confidence in existing religious practices tied to fertility, harvest, and water, prompting communities to adopt new ritual approaches or elevate previously secondary deities associated with the specific hardship they faced. This kind of adaptive religious shift, driven by material necessity, is well documented in numerous ancient societies beyond Mesopotamia as well, and fits comfortably within existing archaeological models of cultural change. Trade and contact provide a third mechanism. As Mesopotamian city-states extended their networks toward Anatolia, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf, new deities, new ritual objects, and new religious ideas would have traveled alongside more mundane goods, gradually blending with or displacing existing local practice, not through conquest necessarily, but through the slow, ordinary process of cultural exchange between trading partners. These explanations account for a great deal. What they explain less comfortably is the sheer speed visible at certain sites. Transitions abrupt enough that a single generation's material culture looks almost unrecognizable from the one before it, without clear evidence of the population itself having changed. The Halaf to Ubaid transition, already examined in this history, is one such case. A widespread, artistically coherent tradition giving way, over a comparatively short span, to a markedly different visual and religious language, still not fully explained by the archaeological record alone. Similar abrupt shifts appear at other points across Mesopotamian prehistory, and in each case, historians face the same basic difficulty. Political, environmental, and trade-based explanations can describe plausible mechanisms for religious change, but rarely can they fully account for why the change, when it came, arrived as quickly as the stratigraphy suggests it did. It is in this gap that more speculative interpretations have occasionally been proposed. Suggestions that certain especially abrupt religious transitions in the ancient Near East may correspond to unrecorded catastrophic events, sudden environmental shocks severe enough to discredit an existing belief system almost overnight, or, at the furthest edges of speculation, some singular, unrecorded event significant enough to be remembered obliquely in later flood myths and tales of divine upheaval. Mainstream archaeologists generally treat these proposals with considerable caution, noting that abrupt-looking transitions in the archaeological record can also result simply from gaps in excavation coverage, or from genuine but gradual change that merely appears sudden due to the limits of stratigraphic dating. The debate, where it exists, tends to center less on whether change occurred quickly at certain sites, and more on whether quickly, in archaeological terms, potentially spanning 1 or 2 generations, should be considered mysterious at all, or simply the normal pace of cultural transformation once the right pressures align. What remains clear across every religious transition traced through this history, from the buried enclosures of Göbekli Tepe to the vanished visual language of the Halaf, to whatever unrecorded pressure first turned Eridu's worshippers away from one set of practices toward another, is that belief in the ancient world was never as static as its temples suggest. Every layer of stone hides an argument, an adjustment, a break with what came before it. What then finally persuaded a whole community to abandon gods their grandparents had trusted completely? And how many such quiet upheavals, unrecorded and now invisible, lie buried beneath temple floors we have not yet thought to dig? The question of what persuades a community to abandon its gods has a quieter counterpart, one that surfaces again and again as this history moves forward. Not why belief changes, but why belief, once established, so often ends up governing everything else. At Uruk, At Eridu, across the whole of early Sumer, the temple was rarely just a temple. It was the largest landowner, the largest employer, the central bank, and the final word on law. And understanding how that concentration of power happened at all is its own unresolved mystery. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, temple institutions in cities like Lagash, Nippur, and Uruk controlled enormous tracts of agricultural land, organized labor for irrigation and construction on a massive scale, managed vast herds of livestock, and redistributed grain and goods to a significant portion of the urban population. Administrative tablets recovered from these cities document a temple economy of staggering complexity. Workers assigned to specific tasks, rations calculated and distributed, debts recorded and tracked, all managed through institutions whose ultimate authority rested on religious rather than purely political grounds. The high priest or priestess of a city's patron deity often held authority rivaling or exceeding that of secular rulers. And in the earliest periods, the distinction between religious and political leadership may not have meaningfully existed at all, a continuation, in more developed form, of the priest-king office already traced to Uruk's earliest seals. How did religious institutions accumulate this degree of practical control over daily economic life? The mainstream explanation treats this as a logical, almost inevitable outcome of how early urban society organized itself. Temples, as the primary centers of large-scale grain storage, necessary to buffer communities against the unpredictable flooding and harvest failures of the Mesopotamian floodplain, naturally became centers of redistribution, and, from there, centers of administrative record-keeping, labor organization, and eventually broader economic control. Religious authority and economic authority, in this reading, grew together, because the same institution was best positioned to manage both from the very beginning, long before any clear separation between sacred and secular administration would have made sense to the people living through it. This explanation fits the archaeological and textual record reasonably well, and most historians of the ancient Near East accept some version of it. And yet, the sheer scale and durability of temple authority across so many independent Sumerian city-states raises a harder question. Why did this particular arrangement, religious institutions functioning simultaneously as government, bank, and employer, emerge so consistently across cities that, in other respects, developed distinct political systems, distinct patron deities, and often fought wars against one another? If temple dominance were purely a practical solution to a shared environmental problem, we might expect more variation in how thoroughly religious institutions absorbed economic control from city to city. Instead, the pattern appears remarkably uniform, as though something beyond practical necessity reinforced it everywhere at once. Some historians point to ideology as the missing piece, the same kingship descended from heaven framework already explored earlier in this history, in which authority of every kind, political, economic, religious, was understood as fundamentally divine in origin, not something humans constructed through negotiation or consent, but something granted from above and administered on the gods' behalf. Under this worldview, a temple's control over land and labor would not have been perceived as a separate, negotiated form of power sitting alongside religious authority. It would have been religious authority, functioning exactly as intended. The same logic that framed civilization's foundational institutions, the me themselves, as objects literally handed down from the gods. At the more speculative edges of this discussion, some writers have proposed that the totalizing scope of early Mesopotamian temple authority reflects deliberate, calculated social engineering by an early priesthood consciously designing a system of control, while others go further still, connecting it to the same broader theories of outside influence already raised, and largely rejected by mainstream scholars in earlier chapters of this history. Historians of the ancient Near East generally find the ideological explanation sufficient on its own, noting that once a belief system frames authority as inherently and inseparably divine, the resulting concentration of practical power requires no additional, more exotic explanation. What remains striking, regardless of which explanation one favors, is how completely the sacred and the practical fused in these earliest cities, how a single institution came to hold the granary, the ledger, the law, and the god's own house within the same set of walls, and how thoroughly that fusion shaped nearly everything we have traced across this history, from the buried enclosures of Göbekli Tepe to the unnamed priest-king of Uruk, to the temple platforms rebuilt across 5,000 years at Eridu. Was this concentration of power the accidental byproduct of a floodplain's demands, or the deliberate architecture of belief, built by people who understood, perhaps better than we do now, exactly how completely a shared idea of the divine could organize an entire society beneath it? Move west now, away from the temple granaries of Uruk and Lagash, toward the dry margins where southern Mesopotamia's floodplain gives way to steppe and desert. It is here, at sites along the edges of the Fertile Crescent, that archaeologists find some of the clearest physical evidence of a pattern that recurs throughout ancient Near Eastern history. Entire populations, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, uprooting themselves and moving, often within the span of a generation or two, leaving behind abandoned settlements whose emptying cannot always be fully explained. The archaeological signature of these movements is distinctive once you know what to look for. A site occupied continuously for centuries suddenly shows a sharp decline in material culture, then abandonment, sometimes for decades, sometimes permanently, while new settlements appear elsewhere, often carrying recognizably related pottery styles, architectural techniques, or burial customs, suggesting the same people simply relocated rather than vanished. This pattern appears repeatedly across the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC in Mesopotamia and the wider Near East, and it raises a question that sits at the edge of what the physical record can answer. What, precisely, sent so many people moving at once? Mainstream archaeology and history point to a cluster of well-documented causes, and in many specific cases the evidence for one or more of them is strong. Climate shifts are among the best studied. Around 2200 BC, a documented period of aridification affected large parts of the Near East, and this has been connected by many researchers to the decline of the Akkadian Empire and the abandonment of numerous settlements across northern Mesopotamia, including sites in the Khabur Plains. Sediment cores, pollen records, and other paleoclimate data lend this explanation real scientific weight, and it remains one of the more solidly supported cases of climate-driven population movement in the ancient world. Warfare and political collapse offer a second, equally well-attested cause. The destruction layers found at numerous Mesopotamian sites, ash, collapsed walls, evidence of violent conflict, correspond in many cases to documented military campaigns recorded in royal inscriptions, providing a rare instance where text and stratigraphy align to confirm cause and effect with real confidence. Displaced populations fleeing a conquered or destroyed city are a well-understood historical phenomenon, and there is little mystery in the basic mechanism, even if the precise numbers involved often remain difficult to pin down. Resource exhaustion presents a third driver, closely related to but distinct from climate change. Some researchers have pointed to the salinization of agricultural land in southern Mesopotamia, a gradual buildup of salt in over-irrigated soil, degrading its fertility over generations, as a slower, less dramatic but equally significant pressure pushing populations to relocate toward less exhausted land, particularly in the later 3rd millennium BC. Textual references to declining wheat yields in favor of more salt-tolerant barley in some periods lend this theory further support, though the full extent of its role in specific migrations remains debated among specialists. And yet, for all these well-supported mechanisms, certain population movements in the archaeological record resist full explanation by any single cause, or even a clear combination of them. Some abandonments appear too widespread, too near simultaneous across sites with different local climates, political situations, and economic circumstances for any one documented pressure to account for the whole pattern. The end of the early Bronze Age across large parts of the Near East, roughly in the 24th to 22nd centuries BC, saw settlement abandonment on a remarkably broad geographic scale. And while historians generally favor an interacting combination of climate stress, political fragmentation, and resource pressure as the explanation, the precise weighting of these factors, which came first, which mattered most, and why the disruption struck so many different regions in roughly the same window, remains a genuinely active area of research rather than a settled conclusion. It is in this uncertainty that more speculative theories occasionally surface, proposals of larger, less visible environmental catastrophes, or chains of cause and effect connecting distant regions in ways not yet demonstrated by current evidence. Mainstream historians generally urge caution against over-unifying what may, in reality, be several distinct regional crises that simply happen to cluster within a similar time frame by coincidence rather than shared cause. The debate persists precisely because the evidence, while abundant, is also frustratingly incomplete. A scatter of abandoned settlements and shifting pottery styles that traces the fact of movement far more clearly than it traces the reasons behind it. What we are left with, across site after site, is the same haunting pattern already touched in this history's exploration of the Halaf people's disappearance. A population present, then gone, its material culture reappearing somewhere else, its true motivations lost somewhere in the silent space between one settlement layer and the next. How many separate human stories, of drought, of war, of soil turned barren, of choices made under pressures we can only partly reconstruct, are folded together into these single, abrupt lines in the archaeological record? And how many of them will ever be told apart from one another at all? Every population movement we've just traced shares an unspoken assumption that there were cities to move toward and cities to move away from in the first place. But step back far enough, and the existence of cities at all becomes its own mystery. Because when we look at the broader map of the ancient world in the 4th millennium BC, we find something almost as strange as any single vanished culture. Cities did not emerge gradually, one leading to the next through simple imitation. They appeared independently in several disconnected corners of the world within a remarkably compressed span of time. Uruk's rise in southern Mesopotamia, already traced across much of this history, occurred roughly between 4000 and 3100 BC. Within a broadly similar window, urban centers were also taking shape in the Indus Valley, in Egypt along the Nile, and somewhat later in China along the Yellow River. Societies with no demonstrated direct contact with one another, separated by vast distances, developing what appears to be the same fundamental innovation: large, dense, socially stratified settlements organized around centralized administration, monumental architecture, and eventually writing. This near simultaneity on the scale of world history is striking. Humans had existed as anatomically modern people for well over 100,000 years before the first cities appeared anywhere. For the overwhelming majority of that time, human settlements remained small, mobile, or modestly sized agricultural villages. And then, within the space of a few thousand years, itself a small fraction of the total span of human existence, dense urban centers began emerging in multiple, unconnected regions at roughly comparable technological stages. Why then? Why not 5,000 years earlier or 5,000 years later? And why in several places at once, rather than radiating outward from a single point of origin? Mainstream archaeology generally resists any single unifying answer, preferring instead a convergence model similar to the one already applied to the independent invention of writing earlier in this history. Separate populations facing broadly similar underlying pressures, arriving at broadly similar solutions without needing direct contact to explain the similarity. Several converging factors are typically cited. Agricultural surplus reaching a critical threshold, allowing a portion of the population to be freed from direct food production for the first time, is one significant piece. Population growth pressing against the carrying capacity of dispersed village life is another. Environmental factors, predictable river flooding in Mesopotamia, the Nile, and the Indus alike, offering fertile soil renewed annually but requiring coordinated labor to manage through irrigation, appear as a recurring theme across nearly every early urban center, suggesting river valley geography itself may have created similar incentives toward centralized organization in each region independently. This explanation accounts for a great deal, and most historians find it broadly convincing as far as it goes. And yet, the timing remains genuinely difficult to fully pin down. Agricultural surplus, population pressure, and river valley geography existed, in varying degrees, for many centuries before true urbanism appeared in any of these regions. What tipped each society, at roughly comparable moments, from complex village life into full urban civilization, complete with monumental architecture and eventually writing, remains an active question rather than a fully resolved one, and the fact that it happened at broadly similar times in unconnected regions, rather than at wildly different points spread across millennia, continues to invite discussion about whether some additional, currently unidentified factor might have been at work across the wider ancient world during this period. It's worth pausing here, as we have at several points across this history, to consider how easily this kind of genuine uncertainty gets filled by more speculative explanations at the field's fringes, proposals of shared external contact, transmitted knowledge, or some common catalyst connecting these otherwise disconnected societies. Mainstream archaeologists find little supporting evidence for direct contact between early Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley at this specific early stage, and generally regard convergent development, driven by comparable environmental and demographic pressures, as a sufficient explanation on its own. But it is precisely because the convergence itself is so striking. Several unrelated human populations, independently, arriving at the same complex social invention within a relatively narrow window of world historical time, that the question continues to feel less than fully closed, even to scholars who firmly reject the more speculative explanations offered for it. What we are left with, then, is less a single unanswered question than a pattern that keeps returning throughout this whole history. Temples rebuilt for 5,000 years on the same ground, writing systems invented independently on different continents, cities rising in disconnected river valleys within a shared, narrow window of time. Perhaps this is simply what human societies do, given similar enough conditions and enough centuries of pressure. Or perhaps we are only now, slowly, learning to see the outline of something larger connecting these separate beginnings. A pattern too vast and too old for any single civilization's own myths to have ever fully explained, waiting, like so much else in this history, beneath ground we have not yet finished digging. Beneath the ground surveyed decades ago in southern Iraq, archaeologists working with aerial and satellite imagery have traced something no single excavation could ever reveal from the surface alone. hundreds of ancient settlement mounds, or tells, scattered across the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, many still unexcavated, some barely more than low rises in the earth marking villages whose names were never recorded anywhere. It is this dense, largely invisible scatter of settlement, the accumulated debris field of one of history's most concentrated bursts of urban growth, that raises a question distinct from why cities emerged at all. Why did so very many of them cluster so tightly, so early, in this one particular stretch of floodplain? By the mid-3rd millennium BC, southern Mesopotamia held one of the highest concentrations of urban settlement anywhere in the ancient world. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Eridu, and dozens of smaller sites, many within a few days' walk of one another, sharing a broadly common language, religious framework, and material culture, while remaining politically independent and, frequently, at war. Survey archaeology conducted across the region in the 20th century, tracing pottery scatter and mound density across the landscape, suggested settlement in some periods reaching a level of concentration rarely matched elsewhere in the pre-industrial ancient world. The conventional explanation begins, as it so often does in this history, with the rivers themselves. The Tigris and Euphrates, particularly in their lower reaches, deposited rich silt across the floodplain with each seasonal flood, creating exceptionally fertile soil capable of supporting agricultural yields well beyond what rain-fed farming elsewhere in the region could achieve. But that same fertility came bundled with a demand. Managing the unpredictable, sometimes violent flooding of both rivers required coordinated irrigation, canal maintenance, and water allocation on a scale no single household or small village could manage alone. Many archaeologists see this as a central driver behind the tight clustering of settlement. Communities drawn together not simply by fertile land, but by the practical necessity of jointly managing the water that made the land fertile in the first place. Trade networks reinforced the pattern. Southern Mesopotamia, for all its agricultural richness, was almost entirely lacking in other essential resources. No accessible timber, no metal ore, no building stone of any real quantity. Everything of that kind had to be imported, from the cedar forests of the Levant, the metal-bearing regions of Anatolia and Iran, the stone quarries further afield. Concentrated urban centers, positioned along the rivers and connected by canal and overland routes, functioned as natural nodes for this long-distance exchange, and the wealth generated by controlling and channeling that trade likely reinforced the advantages of urban clustering over dispersed rural settlement. These explanations are well supported and widely accepted, and together they account for much of what survey archaeology has documented. And yet, certain aspects of the settlement pattern resist full explanation by economic geography alone. The density of settlement in some subregions of the southern floodplain appears to exceed what agricultural capacity and trade advantage alone would predict, based on comparable river valley civilizations elsewhere that never reached quite the same concentration, despite facing broadly similar ecological pressures. Why did Mesopotamia's floodplain fill in so much more thoroughly than other fertile river valleys managing comparable irrigation challenges during the same broad era? Some historians point to the deeply competitive political landscape among Sumerian city-states as an accelerant, each city needing to maximize its own population and agricultural output to defend itself against rival neighbors, creating a kind of self-reinforcing pressure toward ever denser settlement that outpaced pure economic necessity. There is also the question of the countless smaller, still unexcavated mounds visible in satellite surveys, but never formally investigated. Given the sheer number of these sites relative to the handful of major cities that have received sustained archaeological attention, historians generally acknowledge that our picture of southern Mesopotamian settlement remains genuinely incomplete, built disproportionately from the small number of famous, thoroughly excavated cities, while hundreds of smaller settlements that once filled the spaces between them remain almost entirely unstudied. Their populations, their local deities, their specific role in this dense network essentially unknown. At the more speculative edges, some writers have proposed that the extraordinary density of settlement in this specific, comparatively small stretch of floodplain reflects something beyond ordinary economic and political explanation. A landscape considered uniquely sacred or favored, drawing population inward for reasons rooted as much in belief as in practical advantage. Mainstream historians generally consider economic and political explanations sufficient without invoking additional factors, though they acknowledge that religious significance and economic advantage were rarely separate considerations for the people actually making these settlement choices at the time. What remains, in the end, is a landscape more thoroughly filled with human settlement, more densely layered with unexplored mounds than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. A concentration of cities so tight that most of its individual settlements have never once been excavated. Their stories folded silently into a wider pattern we can trace from above, but still barely understand from within. How many separate, forgotten cities lie beneath those small, unexamined rises in the Iraqi plain? And what might they still tell us about why, more than anywhere else on Earth, humanity chose to build so much, so close together, in this one particular stretch of River Silt? The trade networks that helped explain southern Mesopotamia's dense clustering of cities raise a further question, one that becomes sharper the closer you look at the objects those networks actually carried. Lapis lazuli, a deep blue, semi-precious stone found in worked form across nearly every major Sumerian city, in royal tombs, temple offerings, and elite jewelry, despite the fact that its only known ancient source lies over 2,000 kilometers away, in the mountains of what is now northeastern Afghanistan. This single material tells a striking story about the reach of early Mesopotamian trade, and about how much of that reach remains only partially understood. Lapis lazuli appears in Sumerian contexts as early as the Ubaid period, becomes especially prominent by the time of the royal cemetery of Ur in the mid-3rd millennium BC, where it was used lavishly in jewelry, inlay work, and ceremonial objects buried alongside the dead, and continues to circulate throughout Mesopotamian history as one of the most prized materials in the ancient Near East. Yet the distance between Ur and the Badakhshan mines of Afghanistan, the only confirmed ancient source of the stone, represents one of the longest documented trade routes in the ancient world, crossing multiple distinct cultural zones, mountain ranges, and river systems, at a time centuries before anything resembling a unified trade infrastructure connected these regions. How did the stone actually travel that distance? This is where the mainstream picture, though generally coherent, becomes noticeably less precise. Archaeologists working on Bronze Age trade generally favor a model of relay trade, goods passing through a chain of intermediary societies and merchants across Iran and Central Asia, each handling only a portion of the total journey, rather than any single group of traders traveling the entire distance from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia directly. Sites in eastern Iran, including Shari Sokhta, have yielded evidence of lapis lazuli working. Workshops where the raw stone was cut, shaped, and prepared before continuing westward, supporting the idea of a multi-stage network rather than one continuous trade route controlled from either end. This relay model is reasonable and consistent with what we know about long-distance trade elsewhere in the ancient world, but it leaves a considerable amount unexplained. We do not know the specific identity of the intermediary groups who controlled each segment of this route, nor do we have direct textual evidence from the Mesopotamian side describing how these relationships were established, negotiated, or maintained across such vast cultural and linguistic distance. Sumerian, and later Akkadian texts occasionally reference distant trading partners and lands associated with valuable materials, a region sometimes called Arata, mentioned in Sumerian literary texts as a wealthy, distant source of precious stone and metal. Its precise real-world location still debated among scholars, with some proposing it corresponds to regions of eastern Iran or Central Asia, though no firm archaeological identification has been confirmed. If Arata does reflect a real trading partner somewhere along this route, its people, its language, and the specific terms of its relationship with Mesopotamia remain almost entirely unknown to us, glimpsed only through a handful of literary references, composed centuries after the trade itself had already been ongoing for generations. There is also the deeper question of coordination. Moving a valuable, non-essential luxury good across thousands of kilometers through multiple distinct cultural regions, over centuries, without the connecting societies leaving behind detailed records of the arrangement, implies a level of sustained cross-cultural cooperation that is somewhat at odds with how fragmented and often hostile relationships between neighboring ancient societies could otherwise be. Did specific merchant families or guilds maintain long-term control over particular segments of the route, passing knowledge of contacts and pathways down through generations, much as later, better documented trade networks like the Silk Road would eventually operate? Or was the trade looser and more opportunistic than the archaeological pattern suggests, moving through many hands rather than any consistent, organized channel? At the more speculative edges of this discussion, some researchers have proposed the existence of a far more organized, possibly even secretive network of specialized traders, controlling access to lapis lazuli and other prestige goods, deliberately obscuring their routes and contacts to preserve a valuable monopoly. An appealing idea, though one for which direct supporting evidence remains thin. Mainstream historians generally favor the more modest relay trade model, arguing that the absence of detailed records reflects the ordinary limits of what unwritten small-scale exchange leaves behind, rather than evidence of deliberate secrecy. What survives, in the end, is the stone itself, cut, polished, and buried in royal graves at Ur, carrying within its deep blue color a journey of thousands of kilometers that no single surviving document fully describes. Every bead of lapis lazuli recovered from Mesopotamia represents a relationship between distant, mostly unnamed peoples, sustained across centuries, for reasons and through arrangements we can trace only by their most durable evidence, a stone, and the immense largely unrecorded distance it somehow managed to cross. Who, precisely, controlled that first link in the chain, high in the mountains of Badakhshan, and how much of the ancient world's hidden connective tissue still waits, unnamed, somewhere between the handful of trade routes we can prove and the many more we can only infer. That unnamed link at the top of the lapis lazuli trail, the person or people in the mountains of Badakhshan who first decided the stone was worth sending west at all, points toward a different, older question than trade alone. Deciding that a particular stone, a particular color, a particular substance carried enough significance to justify moving it across a continent was not a purely economic judgment. It was, in some sense, a ritual one, and it leads us back to the people whose job, uniquely among their communities, was to make judgments like that. The earliest ritual specialists, whose origins remain far murkier than the polished blue evidence of their influence. By the time Sumerian texts describe temple personnel in detail, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, the roles are already elaborate and highly differentiated. The high priest or priestess already discussed in tracing Uruk's unnamed priest-king. The Gudu priests responsible for maintaining ritual purity. Specialists in divination, in lament, in the preparation of offerings. Distinct categories of temple musicians and singers whose performances were considered essential to proper worship. This is not the profile of a role invented recently. It is the profile of a profession with centuries, likely millennia, of accumulated specialization behind it, refined and subdivided long before any scribe wrote its structure down. The physical evidence pushes that specialization back even further than the texts can confirm. At Göbekli Tepe, already explored at the very start of this journey, the sheer scale and precision of the construction, monumental pillars, quarried, carved, and transported by communities with no agriculture, no permanent settlement, and seemingly no need for structures of that scale for any practical purpose, strongly implies the presence of individuals whose primary role was organizing and directing ritual activity, coordinating labor not for subsistence but for something entirely other. Whether we should call these individuals priests in any meaningful sense or something else entirely. Ritual leaders without fixed institutional titles, respected elders whose authority was religious rather than political, specialists whose role existed only during specific ceremonial gatherings, rather than as a continuous office, remains genuinely unresolved, because a hunter-gatherer society leaves us no administrative tablets to consult. Mainstream archaeology generally treats the emergence of dedicated ritual specialists as a gradual, functional development, tightly connected to the broader story of increasing social complexity already traced throughout this history. As communities grew larger and their ritual practices more elaborate, the sacrifices, the foundation deposits, the accumulating ceremonial knowledge examined earlier at Eridu, some degree of specialized knowledge would naturally have become necessary. Not everyone could be expected to remember the correct sequence of an increasingly complicated ceremony, the appropriate offerings for each occasion, or the specific words believed necessary to address a particular deity correctly. Under this reading, ritual specialists emerged the way most specialized professions emerge, through accumulating complexity that eventually demanded dedicated expertise, formalized gradually into recognized social roles. This explanation is coherent and well supported by comparative evidence from other early societies worldwide, where ritual specialization does appear to track fairly closely with increasing social complexity. And yet certain aspects of the earliest evidence resist being fully absorbed into a purely functional account. The scale of coordinated effort visible at Göbekli Tepe, for a society with no other comparable monumental undertakings, suggests ritual authority that was already, at this remarkably early stage, capable of commanding resources and labor, disproportionate to anything else the society is known to have produced. Why would ritual specialization reach that level of organizational power before agriculture, before permanent settlement, before nearly every other marker we associate with complex society? The conventional model of gradual, complexity-driven specialization sits somewhat uneasily against evidence suggesting ritual authority may, in this particular case, have preceded rather than followed broader social complexity. At the more speculative edges of this question, some researchers have proposed that the earliest ritual specialists possessed genuine specialized knowledge beyond religious authority alone. Astronomical observation, ecological expertise, or medicinal understanding that reinforced their social position through demonstrably useful skill, gradually mythologized over generations into purely religious terms. Mainstream scholars generally regard this as plausible in general outline, but difficult to substantiate in specific cases, given how little direct evidence survives from societies with no writing. Others, further from the historical mainstream, have suggested that the earliest ritual specialists preserved fragments of significantly older knowledge traditions, echoing again the substrate and lost civilization questions already raised, and largely unresolved, earlier in this history. What remains certain is only the shadow such figures cast across everything this history has traced. The buried enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, the unnamed priest-king of Uruk, the elaborate temple bureaucracies of later Sumer, each pointing back toward individuals whose names, faces, and specific beliefs have vanished entirely, leaving behind only the scale and persistence of what they organized. Who were the first people trusted to speak on behalf of the sacred? And what precisely did their communities believe qualified them for a role that predates almost every other institution human history would go on to build